From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus with Paul Salem.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. The war in Afghanistan has dragged on for 16 years already, at a cost of over $1 trillion and many thousands killed. To many Americans, there seems to be no end in sight and no positive outcome. Yet, as General Mattis himself said recently at a Senate hearing, violence and progress continue to coexist in Afghanistan. What is that progress? How much of there is it, and what does it mean? Particularly, what does it mean for Afghans themselves? With me to explore these issues are two guests from Afghanistan, Mr. Saad Mohseni, Chairman and CEO of Moby Media Group, and named by Time, Foreign Policy, the Asia Society as one of the most influential global visionaries and change leaders, advancing press freedom, empowering civil society, and defending women's rights. Welcome, Mr. Mohseni.
Thank you.
And our very own Ahmad Majidyar from the Middle East Institute, who is a resident fellow and director of MEI's IranObserved project, and himself also from Afghanistan. Welcome, Ahmad.
Great to be with you.
Mr. Mohseni, or if I may call you Saad, may I do that?
Please, please.
Thank you very much.
I insist.
What is the progress that General Mattis is talking about? How widespread? How deep? What's its reality?
Well, I think what's extraordinary is that the Afghan nation has moved in ways unimaginable when we first went back to Afghanistan in the very early years. You know, first and foremost, I think I have to point out Afghanistan is a very young country. Median age is 18. Population of 30 million. It's going to grow very quickly. I think in the next 30, 40 years, it's set to triple in size. So we're talking about a 100 million plus nation. It'll be the 16th largest country in the world in the next 30, 40 years. Mm-hmm. But now, if you're looking at the younger generation of Afghans, they've managed to become a lot more educated. We're talking about 35 to 40% literacy rate from a very, very low base, obviously.
That's 34, 40% for the whole population.
For the whole population.
So among young people,
among young people, and that number is going to go up very quickly. You're talking about a population that's very plugged in. So of the 30 million inhabitants, we have something like 22 million people who have a mobile phone. And because of that, they can get information, they can watch television. Electricity rates were around 20, 25% 5-6 years ago. And yet something like 65, 70% of the population watch television.
So are you describing, since the war started, people, see the aspect of war, that it's a war and they don't imagine anything positive happening until the war ends, and it doesn't seem to be ending. How has that progress taken place? Where has it taken place alongside the ongoing conflict? Which cities and how much of the country is benefiting from that?
It's not, I have to point out, it's not like full-on conventional war. The insurgents obviously strike in the cities through terrorist acts. They attack villages, and, that probably has more of a conventional shape. But, we're not talking about sort of a country-wide insurgency, war like Vietnam, for example, where they took on government forces head-on. It's a lot more subtle. It's just as painful. I don't think it takes away the pain. But therefore it's allowed schools to flourish, clinics, businesses, and so forth. People, people are able to lead normal lives. I think one extraordinary thing, and you may see it in other countries as well, is the urbanization of Afghanistan. Now, some of those numbers are not reflected in the data you may see, but people moving into the cities and the cities just expanding, it sort of allows people to lead lives which are a lot more modern. Like, for example, if you live, Ahmed would know this, for example, Charikar is in the province of Parwan, but it's now an extension of Kabul city. So people who live in Charikar, which used to be a small village, Pashtun would live next door to a Hazara. Hazara would live next door to a...
So kind of a transformation of the sociology of the country.
They send their kids to school. They all watch television. They commute back and forth to Kabul. So all of a sudden, this sort of small-time villager from middle of nowhere is sharing...
Is plugged in with society.
His neighbors are people of a different ethnic group. And they can start relating to each other, and they send their kids to school. And all of a sudden, they view things in a totally different way. What's interesting in Afghanistan is that the government has not changed. It remains just as corrupt, just as inept, just as hopeless. But the people have moved on. So the level of sophistication of the population is quite extraordinary. I mean, there's this maturity now that you see in Afghanistan in terms of our viewers and in terms of the, if you look at the roundtables on television and you think, wow, we've come a long way.
Interesting. Ahmad, let me ask you about, indicators in society, whether it's in education or health or urbanization. How would you describe to listeners who don't know Afghanistan and just read headlines which mainly emphasize the conflict?
I think that to measure progress in Afghanistan, we have to look back 16 years ago and see where we started. Because right now, when we talk, for example, about the education, there are about 9 million Afghan children enrolled in schools.
9 million.
1/3 of the children are still out of school. But to see the progress, we have to look back again. Because in 2001, under the Taliban, there were less than 1 million Afghan children in schools. And girls were banned from schooling. So all of them were just boys. And now about 35% of this 9 million children, they are girls. But I think that these numbers are significant. But as an Afghan, even what is more important is just the change in the perception about and the attitude of the Afghan people toward education, toward the women's participation.
How do you mean? How does that manifest itself?
I'll give you just one example. In the previous regimes, when the communist-backed regime was in place in the 1980s, they were forcing people to send their children to school. For example, when it came to women's participation in the workforce or in the society, that was also something that the society was not ready about, and that triggered a lot of widespread backlash in the country. But the progress over the past 16 years has been very much organic. It's now the other way around. We see that Afghan tribesmen from very rural and remote areas, they come to Kabul, and one of their primary demands from the government is to build schools from them. There have been local uprisings against the Taliban in different parts of the country where the Taliban insurgents have burned down or shut down schools. People just hear sometimes say that the Taliban have changed, they have moderated. They give that example that in areas they're controlling now, they're allowing girls to school, but it is the local population's pressure on them. So this kind of change, I think this is something that which would not be reversed. Maybe that 9 million children that go to school, maybe that will be 6 million next year if the security situation will change. But that change in the attitude and the perception of people about democratic values, about women's participation, about civil society, about education, I think that is the biggest change that we've seen in Afghanistan.
Thank you for that. Saad, let me, focus on the issue of women. Obviously, both abroad and inside the country, that's been a big issue. What are the various areas that women have been empowered? Where what still needs to be done? We've talked about education. How would you describe that trajectory?
It's interesting because some of the changes, obviously, people accept women playing a sort of a more prominent role, whether it's in the household or at schools or educational facilities or even in the workplace. I think media, and this is where not just us but other media organizations have played a role, because I think creating strong female role models, giving a voice to women and in terms of how they see things, not just in relation to women, but I think in things in general. I think that's played a very important role because media can facilitate social change. But the other thing is that the economic the realities on the ground. Economic hardship forces a lot of families to allow their women to work in order to survive. So from both sides. From both sides. So sometimes it's funny because a friend of mine who's a journalist said, "Well, listen," he said, "I've gone out there and asked a whole bunch of Afghans if they accept women playing a more prominent role, and most of them said no." I said, "But did you ask them if their daughters go to school? Did you ask them if their wives go to work? Or if they're willing to allow their daughters to go to work?" And the answers to those questions would be yes. So sometimes I think when you see changes like we've seen in Afghanistan, sometimes it's just through necessity. And I think that's also a good thing. It's a combination of both. Now, there's no doubt Afghanistan is a sort of a backward society, and I think this tug of war will continue for some time to come. I mean, we have this program called Afghan Star, which is sort of our idol format, and it's been going on for 14 years, and it's very popular. But this year we've had protests from mullahs in Herat and also in Kabul saying we shouldn't have any women on the show. So 13 years
it's still
on,
a struggle.
Yes, we've pushed. In terms of new things, and we've broken new ground in terms of women singing, performing, dancing, and so forth. And yet, 13 years on, we still have this sort of a pushback.
Still a big issue. Ahmed, let me ask you a bit about, Saad mentioned the political system still being corrupt and a lot of issues there. We might come back to it. But you emphasize changes in values and attitudes. And as Saad also said, urbanization, people living together. Do you see sort of the emergence of a civil society? How is it impacting public life? And how does it impact the government?
No, absolutely. We have a very vibrant civil society in Afghanistan. Unfortunately, the U.S. strategy in Afghanistan has been very much security-centric. And despite the fact that the U.S. and Europeans and others, they have helped the Afghan society, but not enough attention has been paid to that sector. And the civil society in Afghanistan has been playing a very important role in, for example, exposing corruption in the government and holding Afghan officials responsible. And again, coming back to the changes in attitudes and others, as Saad just mentioned, about the role and participation of women in the socio-political issues, right now we have about more than 25% of the members of the Afghan parliament that they are women.
25%?
Yes, that's actually bigger than the percentage here in the United States. But again, even what is more important is that democracy has pressured the ultra-conservatives inside Afghanistan to accept women's participation in politics. In the parliament, we have jihadi leaders from the 1980s. We have former members of the Taliban who would, in the past, totally rule out any role for women in the government. But now they have to just sit down with those women and just discuss political and national issues with them. And because whether it's parliament, whether it's the government, or even the local councils, all these leaders come through elections. They cannot ignore women anymore. I see people very conservative from the past that they had different views about women. Now they're talking about women's rights because they want to gain the votes of those women.
So the change is happening even among those. Let me ask a bit, Saad, about culture and the arts. I mean, I know you're in media business. You mentioned sort of your idol format, but linking it more to civil society and so on. What can you say about the cultural life? How are people expressing themselves through the arts of various forms?
Well, again, it's happening, and it's very organic. It's something you cannot impose on people. So I think people have found ways to express themselves. Traditionally, it's through poetry and singing, but now it's a lot more. It's through rap music. It's through all types of performances. And if you look at there are certain foundations which are now helping promote and develop, build capacity, from carving to painting to sculpting. So we're seeing a big change. I mean, there is civil society is not, if you look at democracy, it's not just about voting. Sure. You need to have civil society.
You need a culture and a society.
You have to have culture, and we talked about role models. Sports, very important for us, and we've developed football in the country, for example. We have a football league that's done very exceptionally well, year 6 or year 7 now. So, but we're there to help. I mean, I think our platforms, and, we have 3 television networks and 2 radio networks. We are very much at the disposal of civil society, of our artists, performers, sports people.
Well, I know also that some of your media institutions have been subjects of attacks, and you've lost some staff members. First of all, condolences for that. But I guess that means the media is seen as a social force, changing values that some jihadis or radicals or the Taliban want to fight against. Could you say a bit more about the media's role really as an agent of change?
Yeah, I think the media has been the agent of social change in the country. And it's not just about entertaining and informing the public. I think in a lot of ways, and Ahmed may agree here, that when people have an issue, they don't call the government. I mean, if there's a crime committed, they actually call the media. When our military forces are surrounded by the Taliban and they can't get help from the defense ministry, they call us to say, could you ensure that the help is fast-tracked? So I think media is playing a very important role. I mean, we have become almost the conscience of the nation because we're also linked into civil society. And as corrupt as as Afghanistan is at an institutional level, I think that we talked about values briefly before. I think the media's played a very important role in terms of defining what those values are, and amplifying the different messages that people need to hear. So I think we're quite proud of what we've done, and I think it's really important in a country like Afghanistan, the Taliban's approval rating is around 10%. So we just got to be very mindful of...
Sort of like U.S. Congress, a little bit.
Yes.
Approval.
Probably the Taliban is more popular than the U.S. Congress.
Yeah.
But what's important also is that we have to always remain very vigilant in terms of not taking anything for granted. I think
let me ask you, what might be a simplistic question. Why isn't, given all that you've described and the effort that's been done and so on, why does the Taliban still do as well as it does, controls big parts of the country? What's missing in the approach either of peacemaking, whether it's negotiation that's missing, or war making, or something else?
It's probably a combination.
How will it be resolved?
Well, the Taliban's approval ratings at 10%, but the government's approval ratings probably at 14%. So the government is also very unpopular. And there is an old adage that, opposition is rarely when it's governments that lose, whether it's their elections or wars or whatever. So they have not managed to win hearts and minds as much as they could have. And also, I think that we've had some serious, especially post-2014, our Afghan National Security Forces sort of didn't quite fragment, but they didn't have the leadership that they needed to have. And the Americans, during Obama's tenure, were actually quite reluctant to help the Afghan National Security Forces. They were very engaged in terms of fighting ISIS, but not so much the Taliban. But we have seen that strategy change during Trump's tenure. And as a result, the Afghan National Forces have managed to push back the Taliban, hence the sort of increase in suicide bombings and attacks. So in terms of the battleground, the Afghans have, I think this year will be the first time in 3 years that they will probably finish the year with net gains in terms of territory. And I think that's
and maybe I'll ask Ahmad this question, how do Afghans see this ending and when might it end? Or do they see the situation as a livable, open-ended situation with an insurgency, in some parts of the country? How do most Afghans look at their future?
Of course, security is just the biggest concern, and there is a consensus amongst all Afghans that there is no military solution to the insurgency problem in Afghanistan. They do want a political settlement to end the war in the country. But the problem here is that the Taliban has the momentum right now. They now control more territory than at any time over the past 16 years. So they do not have any incentive to come to the negotiating table and just make peace because they believe in a military victory, and they believe also that the time is on their side right now. So that's why what's important is that for any peaceful resolution of the Afghan conflict, that the Taliban momentum should be reversed first, and secondly, the Afghan institutions should be strong enough to send a very strong message to the Taliban and to their regional supporters that they will not be the future, they will not have a chance to overthrow the Afghan government, and only then a peaceful resolution would be possible.
Thank you, Ahmad. We're out of time. I really want to thank you both. Saad Mohseni, thank you for coming to DC and joining us at the Middle East Institute. And Ahmad, thank you. And I'm very grateful for you to highlight to our listeners the positive side of what's happening in Afghanistan. And let's hope that there will be in the near future more progress and less violence in Afghanistan. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in. You can join the conversation on our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/Middle East Institute. And see you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.